Everybody. Welcome to the Electoral College meeting in Delaware. We're so grateful to have you here. This is the 2024 Electoral College convening throughout the country in different state capitals. The same exact thing is taking place. It's a great pleasure to have you here. A couple acknowledgments before I get started. First of all, I want to thank the Secretary of State's office. Every time we have asked for them to help out with our civics program, Secretary Bullock has been extremely generous in helping with this. And Ronnie Walz's here. Where are you at, Ronnie? He might have stepped out. There he is back there. Let's have a round of applause, Ronnie. He's been super helpful in making the arrangements for us. And I can't say enough about Delaware State University, who is hosting us today. Every time we reached out to them, setting up the room, organizing the lunch, et cetera, they have been fabulous. I also want to welcome all the teachers who are here today. We are thrilled that amongst the teachers here, we have a number of recent award winners, schools that have won Governor's Excellence in Civics Awards. We have teachers who have won Excellence in Civics Awards. We have students who have won national recognition for programs and projects that they have presented through Project Citizen. So we welcome all of you, and hopefully you'll benefit from today's opportunity. I think 10 years from now, you're going to look back on this and be seeing this as one of the highlights. Very few Americans get to experience what you're about to experience today in terms of witnessing the Electoral College proceedings. So I think you're in for a very memorable day. Our agenda here is at 10:30. We'll, from now on, for about 30 minutes, I'm going to present talking about the history of the Electoral College, and then at 11 o'clock, Secretary Bullock is going to come in, and he's going to talk about more of the details with regards to Delaware and the process it uses for the Electoral College proceedings. And then we'll have a brief intermission of about 15 minutes so that the electors can join us. They'll be sitting at these tables up here. And also there are alternative electors who will be sitting over here, distinguished individuals who we will meet later on. And the formal proceedings will begin at 11:30. Between 11:30 and 12, the actual voting of the Electoral College will take place. And then finally, we'll have a period for question and answers with the electors, which is a really special thing. So be thinking about questions you might have. Some of you have already submitted them. Scott Abbott over here, my colleague, who's the Assistant Director for the Delaware Center for Civics Education, he's going to be facilitating that particular piece, and he has the questions that have been submitted in advance, okay? So our objective in this educational portion of the program is to help deepen your understanding of the Electoral College and its history. I can tell you without hesitation that many, many Americans have no clue how the Electoral College functions. And I've experienced it in my 40 years of teaching, whether it's at the middle school. I've taught middle school, taught high school. I teach college students now, and there's a lot of misinformation and ignorance regarding how the President of the United States is selected. So there are common misconceptions that I would like to address up front. How to pronounce the term. It's not Electoral College. It's not Electrical College. It is the Electoral College, okay? Some people think that there is one place where the Electoral College convenes, like it's a place. That's not the scenario either, but some of the more common, more notable misconceptions I think that need to be cleared up here. The first one is with regards to the idea of the people electing the President of the United States. So I know in my career when I've asked students as a form of a pretest or pre-quiz, who elects the President of the United States, the answer, 98% of the people will say the people do, the voters do. But that in fact is not correct. The Electoral College is the body that elects the President of the United States and the Vice President of the United States as well. Second major misconception that I come across is that when the November elections take place and people go into the voting booths and vote, the assumption is that we know automatically who the President of the United States is going to be, when in reality that's not the case, because it's not until the Electoral College votes are counted, and that doesn't take place until January, that we formally and officially know who the President and Vice President of the United States are. Now, the chances of anything changing between November and January is minuscule. But regardless, the fact of the matter is we don't formally and officially know who the president is going to be until that particular point in time. And then the last misconception I just want to bring your attention to is with regards to how many votes does each state have in the Electoral College? And when you ask that question, the typical response is it's based upon population. And that answer is partially true, but it's not entirely true. In part, the number of votes each state gets in the Electoral College is based upon its population, okay? Because the number of votes in the House of Representatives helps to inform how many Electoral College votes there are. But the correct answer is, in terms of how many votes each state gets, it's the number of representatives in the United States House of Representatives plus the number of United States senators that a state has. So in looking at it clearly for the state of Delaware, Delaware has 2 United States senators right now, Senator Carper and Senator Coons, and we also have 1 representative, Lisa Blunt Rochester. And so you total up the number of senators we have and the number of representatives you have, and that dictates how many votes each state gets in the Electoral College. So today we're going to have 3 electors representing the state of Delaware, whereas in a place like California, because California, there's 39 people plus who live in California, 1 out of every 8 Americans. Delaware, we only have 1 million people living here. So California has 52 members of its House of Representatives plus 2 United States senators, so it gets 54 electoral votes, okay? In addition to that, the District of Columbia is treated as a state, even though it's not one. My colleague over here, Scott Abbott, has yearned for DC to become a state, but it is treated as a state for the Electoral College, so there's 3 additional Electoral College votes thrown into the mix with all the other states, the other 50 states. So in total, there's 538 Electoral College members, okay? And the law requires that any candidate running for the president must achieve a majority of Electoral College votes, which is 270 Electoral College votes. If a candidate doesn't receive 270 Electoral College votes, there's a contingent election that will take place that I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. So here's a map showing that today, at different times, because of the time zone changes, members of the Electoral College for every single state and the District of Columbia will be meeting in their state capitals, casting their votes for President of the United States. Last night I was watching the news, thinking that maybe there was going to be some attention to the fact that today was going to be the day when the Electoral College meets and votes on the President of the United States. I heard nothing at all, despite watching 3 broadcasts. But on NPR this morning I came down, and sure enough, the very first thing that they were talking about in the news was the fact that the Electoral College is convening today. So the question is, when people go into the voting booth in November, what are they actually doing, okay? I mean, if it's the Electoral College that's going to choose the President of the United States, then what are the people who are entering the voting booth actually doing? So I want you to imagine that you're walking into a voting booth and what you see is something that looks like this, okay? So you have, on the one hand, Kamala Harris, and under her name would be Tim Walz, or vice presidential candidate. They're the Democrats running for president and vice president. And then on the other side, you have Donald Trump, the Republican, and his vice president, J.D. Vance. So a person walks in and they cast their vote either for the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate. Unbeknownst to most people entering the voting booth, what has happened prior to the time that the voting takes place, the 2 political parties who have nominated these individuals to represent them have gotten together and selected 3 people, in the case of Delaware, to serve in the Electoral College. So the Republicans chose 3 people and the Democrats chose 3 people, okay? Now, in reality, what's happening is sort of behind the scenes, what voters are actually doing is they're trying to show who they want to go and serve in the Electoral College. So they're called slates of electors. So you see 3 Democrats here, 3 Republicans here. When people are voting in November, on November 5th, or in the general election, what they're really doing is saying, I want either the Democratic electors to go and vote in the Electoral College, or I want the Republican electors to go and vote in the Electoral College. Now, if Kamala Harris received the majority or plurality, more than anybody else, of the popular votes in the state of Delaware, then what happens is her 3 electors come today and they will cast their votes for Kamala Harris, all right? The other Republican electors will not serve. So it's like their responsibilities are ended. They never get to perform their duties in the Electoral College. If, on the other hand, in Delaware, the majority of people in Delaware had voted for Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, then the Republican electors would be showing up today voting, and the Democratic electors would never be here. Is that clear to everybody, how that works? Okay. So here's the results of Delaware's election, all right? And so when the people of Delaware voted on November 5th, 57% of them voted for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. So as a result of that, she won by like 75,000 votes, popular votes. The 3 people who are coming here today are going to be voting for Kamala Harris. At least that's what they're pledged to do, okay? In the National Electoral College vote, these were the results that you see on the screen. Donald Trump received 312 electoral votes nationally, and Kamala Harris received 226. So we can anticipate today, if everybody does what they're expected to do, that 312 votes will go to Donald Trump and 226 votes will go to Kamala Harris, and Donald Trump will be elected president of the United States. Notice that it says anticipated there, because something could happen at the Electoral College that might change that. I would like to welcome Secretary of State Jeffrey Bullock here. So I give a round of applause for our Secretary. Who I'll be introducing shortly. So here's the Electoral College timeline. On November 5th, the general election took place, and you'll notice I'm not going to read through these all, but if you look at the first two bullets there, November 5th and December 17th, law specifically prescribes on which day the general elections have to take place. It's the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, and they also specify when the Electoral College must meet, which is the first Tuesday after the second Wednesday in December. Now, I don't know who spent a lot of time thinking about those particular days. That's something maybe you'll want to go back and research, but I don't see myself spending a lot of time doing it myself, okay? Anyway, what happened today is the votes take place. It is responsibility of the Secretary of State's office to send to Washington, D.C., to the President of the Senate and also to the National Archivist, copies of the electoral votes, which are up here sitting on the table here. By December 25th, they received there, and then they are transferred over to Congress on January 6th. And then before two houses of Congress, the Vice President of the United States, who's also the President of the Senate, will get to read the votes and announce who the formal person is. So interestingly, this year, Kamala Harris, who was Donald Trump's opponent in the election, is going to announce after counting the votes that Donald Trump has defeated her in the Electoral College. So how did this Electoral College come about? A little bit of the history here. When the colonies broke away from England, they essentially had no government. So they had to start their own government. The very first government of the United States was called the Articles of Confederation. It was a failure. There was lots of reasons why it was a failure. Among those reasons was they decided not to have a president, okay? Because they were so used to a king who they disliked, they decided that they were going to have a government that was, in effect, headless. No executive branch. They also decided it was not going to have a judicial branch either. So all it was a Congress, okay? So they decided to have an executive branch. So one of the very first things that they had to think about was how are we going to choose who our president and vice president are going to be? So they spent a lot of time, okay, and they had two options that they thought of. So I want you to be thinking about this, students. Like, is there a great way to choose the executive that maybe somebody has not considered so far? In the waning days of the Constitutional Convention in September of 1787, basically they had arrived at two possibilities. Either Congress, the legislature, would choose the president, okay, or the people would be entrusted to choose the president. All right, so these were the two big options. There was a third option on the table that state governments would choose the president, but that one sort of got set aside. In looking back on the records, to the founding fathers who served at the Constitutional Convention have described the discussions around this question, how should the president be elected, as both tedious, and in one case, James Wilson suggested it was the most difficult decision that they had to make. Now, that's a pretty surprising comment coming from a guy who attended this convention because, as many of you know, like two of the really important topics that they had to discuss were how many votes each state would get in the national legislature. That led to what's now known in every American history textbook as the Great Compromise. And then the second thing they had to decide was how would enslaved people be counted for purposes of representation? And that led to the horrendous 3/5 compromise. So here we have James Wilson suggesting that the most difficult decision that they had to make was actually how to choose the president of the United States. All right? So the idea began to take form at the very early stages. The Constitutional Convention met from May until September of 1787. And what happened was they kept revisiting the question because they could not come to an accepted conclusion. So what they decided to do was to create a committee called the Committee on Postponed Matters. And what they would deal with was they would work on the side, not in the whole convention, but on the side, trying to iron out all the unsettled, unresolved issues that had to be figured out. And Each state was given one person that could represent the state at this Committee of Postponed Matters. Delaware's was John Dickinson, very famous. And John Dickinson, according to John Sweeney, who used to write for the News Journal, who now is retired, but he writes books and has a particular affinity for John Dickinson, has suggested that John Dickinson played a pretty significant role in deciding that the Electoral College would be the way that the President of the United States would be chosen. Apparently, John Dickinson had to be in Delaware for a while, and when he returned to Philadelphia in September of 1787, the Committee on Postponed Matters was about to present their idea to the Congress, the entire Continental Congress, or excuse me, Constitutional Convention, and it would have suggested the Congress of the United States would choose the president. John Dickinson, by this time, had opportunity to see all the powers that had been given to the United States government under the new Constitution, and was really scared of the idea that Congress would be given the opportunity to choose the president and not the people. So he stepped in, intervened, as did a number of other delegates, and in a sort of last-minute move, they decided to change their idea, and they came up with the Article 2 of the Constitution, which stipulates how the President of the United States is to be selected. And this gave birth to what you're about to see and experience today, the Electoral College. Okay? Recently, in a Supreme Court decision I'll talk about in a couple seconds, Justice Elena Kagan on the United States Supreme Court has suggested that this was a sort of 11th hour compromise, that it wasn't until September, and the Constitutional Convention ended on September 17th, that the delegates finally, after having all these challenging debates about how the president should be elected, that they decided on having the Electoral College be the process for doing that. James Madison is basically arguing here in one of his primary source documents that by this time in September of 1787, many of the delegates were really tired and becoming impatient. They were wanting to return back to their farms to harvest their crops, et cetera, and it's almost like the suggestion here from James Madison was that they sort of put this thing together, but in a somewhat hasty manner, but not in such a hasty manner that it wasn't really well thought out, okay? So the term Electoral College appears nowhere in the Constitution. It's nowhere. The word electors does. So the three individuals who are going to be voting today are known as electors. But this idea of Electoral College, it's a mystery to me where the idea of this being a college comes from, although I can speculate on that a little bit. Alexander Kazar, who teaches up at Harvard University, has written a really big book that your teachers are going to get today to take back to your library, courtesy of our Secretary of State. And he has done some research in trying to figure out when the term Electoral College first appeared, and he has traced it back to 1788 in one of the Anti-Federalist papers. And this is the quote that is cited as the very first appearance of this term, Electoral College. So shortly after the Constitution was presented to the American people, after the Constitutional Convention came to a close, there was immediate reaction to this idea of having an Electoral College choose the President of the United States. Thomas Jefferson at one time is quoted as saying it's the most dangerous blot on our Constitution. And here you see another document, a newspaper from Kentucky, in which the Kentucky people are arguing, much like Jefferson, that it should be the people who choose the president, not the Electoral College. But this is just a reaction to the paper, okay? What they didn't know was how this idea would actually play out in presidential elections. So in the very first presidential elections, George Washington was known he was going to be the President of the United States, so there wasn't going to be any problems with regards to that. But in the two after George Washington stepped down as President of the United States, there were problems that arose. The electors, the Founding Fathers did not anticipate that there would be political parties in the United States. And so in 1796, we had the Electoral College choose a president of one party and a vice president of a different party, which is not something that is ideal. And then in the next election, the election of 1800, you see here, there was a tie in the electoral vote, mainly because the way the Electoral College was set up is every elector was given 2 votes. They could vote for whoever they wanted to. So if all the members of a political party voted for their 2 people, or 2 candidates, president, vice president, it would result in a tie. So as a result of this problem, they added to the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, which now says that when people go in to vote for president and vice president. They have to vote for the tickets. They can't vote for them separately. All right. So a couple major concerns about the Electoral College that have persisted over the years, and then we're going to talk about why we have Electoral College. So since 1940, when polling took place, we have found that somewhere around 60% of the American people vote against the idea of not having the president chosen by the people. Okay, so to some extent, it's an unpopular institution, but we still have it. So I'm going to get to that point here. But I want to show you a cute little video that's going to be interrupted.
Ways gives you the freedom to tell your story. With a
This is a group of third graders
professional website. Now,
doing an exercise in class. Let me see if I can.
reflect.
Sorry about this. It's not working. It's not skipping for me. I'm going to skip past this. That's all right. We'll come back to this after that. But it's a really cute video showing third graders doing an activity. Let's talk about the concerns with the Electoral College. Why is it so unpopular? Well, on one hand, people are dissatisfied with the Electoral College because it's possible that a person can receive more popular votes than their opponent but still lose the presidency. And this has happened 5 times in American history. I don't need to go through all these, most recently in 2016. So that's one reason why people are concerned about having Electoral College choose a president and not the popular vote do it. The other concern is with faithless electors. Faithless electors are people who are committed, supposedly, to coming and voting for a particular candidate, but then what happens is they vote for a different candidate, and therefore they become faithless to the person who they were pledged to vote for. The number of times when this has happened is 90 over the course of American history. The most that has ever happened was in 1872 when Horace Greeley, who was a candidate for president, was elected in the popular vote but died before the Electoral College met. So what happened is his electors were now pretty much freed up to vote for somebody else, which is exactly what they did. So 1/3 of all the people who have become faithless electors in United States history, in effect, were attributed to one single election. In 2016, there were 7 people who voted for people who they were not expected to vote for, and that's been the most in most of American history except for that one election in 1872. But never once has a faithless elector in any way come close to impacting the outcome of a presidential election. The question then becomes, when electors are chosen to come to the Electoral College, are they required to vote for a particular person? And secondly, if they don't vote for a particular person, is there a penalty for not doing so? So the Supreme Court has answered those questions on 2 occasions. In 1952, in the case of Ray versus Blair, the question was, does an elector have to vote for the candidate who their party has them pledged to vote for? And the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that political parties can require their electors to vote for a particular candidate. So typically, before electors come in, so like today, they'll have taken a pledge that they were going to vote for Kamala Harris, okay? And that is constitutional. The next question is, what if a person doesn't? Can there be a punishment for that person, a sanction against voting against the original idea? And the answer under the Supreme Court decision in 2020, this is very recently, was that in fact states can punish or penalize individuals for voting against the person they're pledged to vote for. So the state of Washington, as an example, has a $1,000 fine for faithless electors, okay? In addition to that, a person who votes against who they were pledged to vote for, their vote can be invalidated, and a substitute or alternative elector can be stepped in their place, and they can replace that person. So those cases have been decided. And here's the law, at least as far as I know, in the state of Delaware, that they are required to vote for the candidate who receives the plurality of votes in the popular elections. So other concerns, the contingent election. Another reason why people are concerned about the Electoral College is because what happens if no candidate receives a majority of Electoral College votes, all right? So we're getting close to time, okay. So in that case or instance, what happens is the House of Representatives will choose the president and the Senate will choose the vice president. So even if the Electoral College doesn't work, then what we have is not the people's vote counting towards who becomes the president, but rather the House of Representatives will. So we are getting close to the time when I need to step back and give time over to Secretary of State Jeffrey Bullock. But I do want to say something here quickly. There are a lot of reasons why people prefer the Electoral College, and the very fact that people have attempted on occasions to not make it happen. Over the course of American history, there have been almost 800 constitutional amendments introduced into the Congress to try and abolish the Electoral College. None of them have succeeded, which is an indication that people believe, in effect, that the Electoral College is a good way of doing things. Maybe not perfect, but it's good. And I'll just leave you with this closing thought that Alexander Hamilton, I think, had it perfectly right when he said, if the manner of choosing the President of the United States is not perfect, at least it is excellent. And so today, you have the distinguished honor of being able to witness this Electoral College process. So I'm going to end there. Here we are now in Dover, Delaware, where under law, the Electoral College must meet in the state capitals. And I'm going to turn it over to our Secretary of State, Jeffrey Bullock, who let's give him a big round of applause. And again, I want to say this, and I want to say this to you in all genuineness and sincerity. He is our 80th Secretary of State, and he has been serving as an amazing public servant for most of his life, and we owe a deep sense of gratitude to all that he has done. And much of what we do in civics education is a result of the support that he has given us, and we really appreciate that. So I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Am I messing you up if I stand down here? You guys back there. Am I messing you up? I'm okay. All right. That's where I want to be. So good morning, everybody. Good morning. How's it going? Where are y'all from? How many people from Sussex County? Thank you for coming up. And from the great state of great county, Kent, where we are right this minute. Nobody? How about from Newcastle County, my home county? And I don't think it could be. Well, welcome to Dover. How many of you have been to Dover before? All right. How many of you have been to Dover before? I apologize for this voice. I don't have much of it this morning. Welcome to the state capitol, where, as I think Fran said, this particular meeting by law has to be held in Kent County. It has to be held in Dover, which is our capital, obviously. And we do it every 4 years, obviously, with the election of the president and the vice president. So now the tough questions. How many of you knew when you walked in here this morning that when, I don't know if any of you are 18 and could vote this past election, but your parents or whoever you knew who voted last month, how many of you knew that when you voted for president and vice president, you were actually voting for 3 electors? Anybody? You did? You get the prize. And that the actual election of the president and the vice president would not occur for another month in December. Yeah, that's how we do it. How many of you think that's a good idea? Yeah, there's a little bit. You're not quite sure. Well, it is a very high, I am with you, by the way. In fact, I'm not even with you. I don't think it's a good idea. And I like the idea of a popularly elected, what do you tell me to do? You can just tell me. Go this way. I'm going to wander. I'm like the talk show host. I like to wander around the room, and I'm messing up their video, which I really don't care. And when you're leaving office, you don't care anymore whether you mess up a video or not. This has been the way we've done things since, as you were just told, since the beginning of the Republic. It's worked relatively well. I'm not sure it works as well as it did in the beginning. And the reason I say that is because we've had now several elections in recent years where one candidate won the popular vote and another candidate became the president of the United States. And that doesn't sit well with me, and other people. And there is some effort to change it. As was pointed out, it's not been successful. I don't think it's going to be successful, probably not in my lifetime, maybe in yours. But I think we'll probably keep the system the way it is. So one of the great things about our country is it is not only acceptable, but it is encouraged that we have that kind of discussion, that we have that kind of debate, that we kind of disagree about really, really important things like how do you elect, the President of the United States, and that's acceptable, right? What's not so acceptable is for people who don't get their way then to sort of foment violence and sometimes revolt as a result of not getting your way. I just told you, I don't agree. I'm a sitting Secretary of State. I don't agree with the way we elect a president. In about an hour, I'm going to preside over the election of the president in a way that I don't think is entirely correct, right? That's the way our country works. We're a country where the rule of law is important, where you have to follow and obey the law. And if you don't like the laws and you think they're wrong, you go out and change them, including amending the Constitution to change the way that we elect a president. But that's the way we're going to do it today. And in a little bit, you're going to see this process unfold. It's relatively simple. It's a little bit formal for me. I have to read some stuff that was written a long time ago, and I don't think it's written particularly well, but I'm going to read it exactly as I'm supposed to read it, and that's the way it's going to go. And I'm just happy that you all are going to be able to be part of that. 4 years ago, we were talking outside. 4 years ago, we were at DSU, but we were over at one of their gymnasiums. We're all masked up because of COVID. Nobody could hear really what we were saying, and it was not the best way to do things. We didn't have anybody like you here, and this year we're back to the way I think we should do it. And I'm glad that you were all able to join us today. So I don't want to make up. You just heard a little bit of a lecture. I don't want to give you too much more, but I do want to open it up for anybody who has any questions or comments or something they want to say, particularly your questions. Somebody has to break the ice. Oh, you're going to do it. Thank you very much. That's a great question. The question is, how are the electors chosen? So every 4 years, in an election year, there is a convention of the major political parties in our country. And there are currently two, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. I, by the way, am a Democrat. You should always know who you're talking to in these situations. I'm a Democrat. And the Democrats and the Republicans join in convention. I forget, honestly, where they were this year. Not in Delaware. And they nominate somebody to be as their candidate for president and their candidate for vice president, right? And so they're the two. This year it was Vice President Harris on the Democratic side and former President Trump on the Republican side. So they're the ones who are going to face off in the November election. So shortly then after that, the parties nominate their candidate. The leaders of the political parties, those two political parties, in each of the 50 states will come together and decide who their electors are going to be. And they tend to be people who've been very loyal to the party, maybe the party chair or a local county chair or just somebody who's been a very loyal Democrat or a very loyal Republican. They're usually the ones who get the nod. The number of electors, and you probably said while I was out of the room, the number of electors is determined by the combination of how many senators and representatives, what we call the congressional delegation, the size of the congressional delegation that goes to Washington. So in this case, how many senators do we have in Delaware? How many representatives do we have in Delaware? How many electors do we get? That's it. Simple math. And so we get 3. We've always gotten 3. If we have our population increases by a little bit more, the next time we determine the allocation of representatives, we may get boosted up to 2, but I don't think it's going to be anytime soon. So we're pretty much always going to have 3. So that's how we come up with. That's how they are. I don't know if the proper term is nominated or selected, and that's how they end up here. And then, literally, they're the people that you elect or that are elected on election day. You guys, I heard the discussion of the faithful versus the faithless electors. We do have a law, as you saw, in this state that requires electors to be faithful to whoever the popular vote has chosen. And if somebody doesn't do that today, what's going to happen? Rhonda is going to remove them from this room, and one of the alternates will take their place. And what happens if those alternates don't do the right thing either? Rhonda will remove them as well, and I'm going to have to pick one of you to be an elector, which I don't think has ever been done in the history of the country. And if you don't choose the right person, you'll be removed too, until it ends up being Fran or somebody. But we will have 3 votes for Kamala Harris today, because that's the way our law works. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Why do you think that people are so resistant to changing the electoral college? Like,
Say it again.
why do you think that people are resistant to like changing or moving the electoral college?
Well, I think the first reason is I don't think people understand it, right? I think people, most Americans, if you polled them, think when they go to the polls on election day, whoever wins, wins, right? And that is technically true, right? Except when you have these situations, as was the case, 8 years ago, when Secretary of State Clinton, no, I don't think she was Secretary of State, when Hillary Clinton ran for president against President Trump. And she won the popular vote. She won it by millions of votes. It wasn't that close. But she lost the Electoral College. And it goes to the way the country was set up, and have an advantage, right? Your vote in Delaware matters more than a vote in California. It's just true, and it's because of those. It's because of those 2 senators, basically, that every state gets. So why do people resist change? I think because, number one, they don't fully understand the system that they have, right? And because, by and large, they've been okay with the solution. I mean, in this election, for example, we're going to elect today a new president who won the popular vote. He did. He won more votes than Kamala Harris, and he should be the president of the United States. Whether you like his politics or not, he won. He won fair and square, and he should be the president of the United States. And so the sort of pressure's off, when it works that way, right? Other questions? Yes, sir.
Do the electors we're going to see today also vote in the general election or no?
When you say do they vote,
Do they
they're
also vote,
citizens just like
yeah,
I
do
am?
they vote as like the common citizen in the general election
Sure.
as well as this? Or?
Yep, they do. They're just residents of our state, right? Just like you or me. And there's nothing special about them except their political party has chosen them for this role today, right? And then once they're done, they're done. They're essentially speaking for all of us who voted for, in this case, Vice President Harris. Yes, sir.
What would be the process for somewhere like Puerto Rico getting electoral college votes, the same way DC does?
Puerto Rico? Territories like Puerto Rico? Do they have electoral votes? Yeah, I don't think they do. I don't think they do. Yeah. What's that?
DC is the only place that gets votes in electoral college.
Okay. Yeah. Well, but you had a follow-up. I'm sorry.
What would be the process for them to gain those votes?
Statehood. I think that would be the direct line to them getting electoral votes would be statehood, which again is another sort of a little bit of a problem with the system, right? I mean, you have, I don't know how many people live in Puerto Rico, but more than live in Delaware, and but their votes essentially don't matter in terms of the selection of a president, which is not good, in my view. Yes, ma'am.
So does DC, do they have electoral votes as well?
I think DC does have electoral votes, right? 3, yeah. But they don't have senators or a member of Congress. They have a delegate in the House of Representatives, but they don't have U.S. senators. Yeah. Yes.
So if the process for the electoral college were to change, how would it change?
It would be up to, that would be up to however the Constitution was amended to change it, right? There is a number of states, I believe including Delaware, have passed laws for there just to be a popular vote, right? Essentially to get rid of the Electoral College, just have a popular vote, right? And but it requires, there are a couple different ways to amend the Constitution. It is not easy, as was pointed out. There have been, how many did you say, how many proposed amendments? 800? 800 proposed amendments. And very, very few of them make it because it's such a difficult process to enact a constitutional change. But it could, the Constitution could be amended not just for an electoral college, but for anything. You know, there's nothing, it's literally not set in stone. Yes?
Do you ever see like the United States implementing like ranked choice voting on a large scale?
Say it again, I'm sorry.
Do you ever see the United States implementing ranked choice voting on a large scale?
That's a great question too. I don't know. It's had, do you know what ranked choice voting is? Ranked choice voting is when you have a contested election, obviously, and you know, let's say there's 5 candidates in the election, and you all vote, and the 5 candidates, you know, one gets, you know, 30%, and one gets 29%, and I can't do the math, the rest of the math, but it adds up to 100. And but nobody gets a majority, right? And so the number 1 candidate does not get a majority if that is the way that that particular voting is supposed to work. And so you start eliminating other people, like from the bottom up, who didn't succeed, and their number 2 choice then gets counted in, and their number 1 choice gets counted in, and until you have somebody who gets a majority vote. And some people think it's a fair way to elect somebody in, particularly when you have races that might have multiple candidates. Maybe you have 10 candidates or 20 candidates, and the winner only gets a small percentage of the vote. And it's like, that's not very fair. I mean, you got 15% of the vote, but you win the election because there were 10 candidates in the race or 15 candidates in the race. And so it's a way of some people believe it's a better reflection of the electorate's preference, right? Some people disagree and say, hey, an election's an election. If you get the most votes, whether it's 15% or 99%, winner's a winner. You got the most votes. That's the way it goes. So it's been tried mostly in cities around the country. I think it's interesting. I think Alaska actually does it for congressional races, for some statewide races. I don't know that any other state does. It's interesting. It's interesting. I don't know that it'll catch on, to be honest. It's complicated. It is, I think for candidates, very complicated. Because you literally will have candidates who will begin running to be like the second choice, right? Because it's a multi-candidate race, and that second choice is going to matter, right? So it's like, if you don't like me that much, you just like me a little, it's okay, just vote, just put me down in second. That's all I'm asking, right? So it's much more complicated. So, but it's an interesting way to elect people. Yes, you guys have a lot of questions. This is great, by the way.
So electoral votes, I know some states are apportioned differently, like winner takes all versus proportional voting. How much does that impact an election? Like how different vote?
It hasn't mattered a whole lot. The questions around, there are a couple states, I know of at least 2, that it's, in most states it's winner take all. Like in Delaware, Kamala Harris wins the popular vote, she gets all 3 votes. I think Donald Trump won Sussex County, and so you could make an argument, well, maybe Trump should have gotten one of those electoral votes because he did pretty well in Sussex County. I don't know. But there are a couple states where that divide by congressional districts. I think Maine is one, and Nebraska, is it Nebraska? Nebraska is one. where if you win the congressional district, you win the electoral vote, right? But it's not, those are relatively small states, and it hasn't had much of an impact. There were some scenarios in this election that just passed where I think it was the congressional seats in Nebraska that they thought might be decisive. The evening did not go that way, and it didn't end up being important, and it never has. But you know, is that fair? I don't know. I don't know. The congressional districts are not all the same size. We have a very large congressional district in Delaware. We have over 1 million people. We have 1 member of Congress. And so it's one of the larger congressional districts, and it may be the largest congressional district now in the country. So, yes, ma'am.
Do you think it would be like fair or effective for someone to be elected by like popular vote?
Do I think it would be fair?
Yeah, like fair or effective.
I do. You know, I do. Especially for an office like president or vice president or governor, which is how we do it, or United States senator, which is how we do it, or member of Congress, which is how we do it. It just seems strange to me that it is arguably the most important office. We don't do it that way. And I understand all of the arguments of our founding fathers, and they were all fathers, and why they did it the way they did it. But it was a few years ago. It might be time to update. Yes?
So as a proponent of popular vote, the issue that we have with the Electoral College with swing states being a predominant force in
Yes.
driving campaigning, do you think that switching to the popular vote would mediate that, reduce it, or would it just turn into a city versus rural campaigning strategy?
It would be more of the latter, I think. Yes, it would definitely mitigate these so-called purple states would become less important. And that's okay by me. And states like California would become much more important because a whole bunch of people live there. And the large population states would get probably more attention. You know, California, since I just picked on California, doesn't get a whole lot of attention in a presidential election. Presidential candidates don't go to California very much. You know why? Because it's a very Democratic state. They don't have to, right? Because a Democrat's probably going to win that state. And the same used to be said about New York, maybe a little less so these days. The same, believe it or not, used to be said about Florida. Definitely not the case anymore. So yeah, so it kind of, you see a lot of these battleground states, as they say, are purple states. They get a ton of attention in a presidential race because they will determine who wins and who loses. And they tend to be like super, super close states, right? Like maybe 100,000 votes or 10,000 votes in a big state like Wisconsin or Michigan or Pennsylvania, you know, will determine the outcome of an election. I'm just not sure about that. All right, a bunch of people are coming in. Ronnie's telling me that we have to stop. All right, well, thank you all very much. Tell me how I do when it's all over. I'll try not to mess up. Ronnie's going to tell me if it's all right to start. Ronnie? Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Jeff Bullock, and I'm the Delaware Secretary of State. And I'd like to welcome everybody here this morning to DSU, to Delaware State University, and to our state capital of Dover. We were talking a little bit earlier about 4 years ago when we also met here at DSU, and it was a little different circumstance for a bunch of reasons, one of which was COVID. And we were all masked up, and nobody could really hear each other, and it was a very awkward electoral college for our state. It's the fourth time that I've done this, and it's always very special. It's really special to have all these students here today joining us from all three Delaware counties. So under the law, Delaware law, and the Constitution of both the United States and Delaware, it is my responsibility to convene this meeting of the Electoral College of Delaware for the purpose of electing the President and the Vice President of the United States. I want to thank, first of all, Delaware State University, Dr. Allen, my friend John Starkey, all the folks from DSU who are here for letting us impose upon them for these proceedings. I also want to thank our state election commissioner, Anthony Albence, which I haven't seen Anthony. I don't know if he's here. He's not here. For the work that he has done this year, and our county elections officers have done, and as well, if I may, my fellow secretaries of state up and down in all 50 states, most of whom are chief elections officers, and all of the county officials, and particularly the volunteers who volunteer on election day and really make our system work. We had this year, as we have had in the past, free and fair elections that have been run extremely, extremely well here in our state of Delaware and in every state in the United States. And I always want to recognize the incredible work that they have done. I want to thank and welcome Fran. Where's Fran O'Malley? Fran was here somewhere. There he is. And you didn't let Ed Friel come today? You made him stay home?
It has some family medical situations.
You know, whatever he's got going on. They represent the University of Delaware's Institute for Public Administration at the Biden School of Public Policy and Administration, and as well as the students who are here to witness these official proceedings. It is so much better when we have this kind of public participation. And to our President-elect and our Vice President-elect, again, a little bit different outcome in Delaware than in the rest of the country. But to our President-elect in particular, we anticipate here today and throughout our country a peaceful transition of power, as there should be. And our nation, as always, stands ready to support the President and his administration in uniting our country and advancing progress for every American. I'm honored to be joined today especially by our presidential electors, who will make history today, as they have done every 4 years, by casting their votes for President and for Vice President of the United States. This year's presidential electors are Cassandra Marshall, Terry McIver, and Jane Hovington. And thank you, ladies, very much for your participation. As we were talking to the students a little bit ago, the process for nominating and selecting the electors and having them vote is established by the United States Constitution and by the laws of our state. Shortly after the Democratic and Republican parties nominated the presidential and vice presidential candidates at their respective national nominating political conventions this past summer, the state leaders of the parties nominated electors to stand for those candidates and sent those names to Delaware's election commissioner. In November, obviously, we cast our vote as citizens. Those votes were tabulated and then certified by the superior courts of each county. The results are then sent to the governor, who added together each county's votes and ascertained the names of the winning electors. The governor then prepares the following certificate of ascertainment, which reads, and again to the students here, I didn't write this. Whereas an election was held in the state of Delaware on Tuesday, the 5th day of November, in the year of our Lord 2024, that being the Tuesday next after the first Monday in said month, in accordance with the provisions of the Constitution and laws of the state of Delaware, in that behalf, for the purpose of choosing by ballot 3 electors for the election of a president and vice president of the United States. And whereas the official certificates or returns of said election held in the several counties of the said state, in due manner made out, signed and executed, have been delivered to me according to the laws of said state by the Superior Court of said counties, and having examined said returns, and enumerated and ascertained the number of votes for each and every candidate or person voted for as one of such electors, the results appear as follows, to wit: Cassandra T. Marshall, 289,758 votes. Terry McIver, 289,785 votes. Jane Hovington, 289,758 votes. Joy Gregor, 214,351 votes. James Weldon, 214,351 votes. Janice Colmary, 214,351 votes. The certificate of ascertainment reveals that the duly elected and chosen electors for President and Vice President of the United States are Cassandra T. Marshall, Terry A. McIver, and Jane E. Covington. Congratulations. At this time, I'm going to turn the meeting over to our electors to cast their votes for President and Vice President according to the laws and the constitutions of both our state and the United States. The electors will now conduct this portion of the meeting. And I believe, Cassandra, you are the chair of the...
That's correct.
Very good.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Cassandra Marshall, and I am one of Delaware's 3 presidential electors.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jane Hovington, and I am one of Delaware's 3 presidential electors.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Terry McIver, and I am one of 3 of Delaware's presidential electors.
Thank you. Electors, I, Cassandra Marshall, volunteer to serve as the chairperson of this electoral delegation. Do you agree?
I agree.
I agree.
Thank you.
Electors, I, Jane Hovington, volunteer to serve as the secretary of the electoral delegation. Do you agree?
I agree.
I agree.
Madam Secretary, the certificate of vote is before us. Electors, I, Cassandra Marshall, am casting my vote for Kamala D. Harris of the state of California for President of the United States and Tim Walz of the state of Minnesota for Vice President of the United States.
Electors, I, Jane Hovington, am casting my vote for Kamala D. Harris of the state of California for the President of the United States and Tim Walz of the state of Minnesota for Vice President of the United States.
Electors, I, Terry McIver, am casting my vote for Kamala D. Harris of the state of California for the President of the United States and Tim Walz of the state of Minnesota for Vice President of the United States.
Electors, we will now individually proceed to sign the certificate of vote. I ask that each elector sign the duplicate originals of the certificate of vote as well. As chairperson, I will begin, followed by Ms. Hovington, followed by Ms. McIver. We, the undersigned, electors of President and Vice President of the United States of America, for the respective terms beginning on the 20th day of January AD 2025, being electors duly and legally appointed and qualified by and for the state of Delaware, as appears by annex certificate made and delivered to us by the executive of said state, having met agreeably to the provisions of law at Dover in the state of Delaware on the first Tuesday after the second Wednesday in December of the year 2024, being the 17th day of said month. Do hereby certify that being so assembled and duly organized, we proceed to vote by ballot and balloted first for president and then vice president by distinct ballots. And we further certify that the following are two distinct lines, one of the votes for president and the other of the votes for the vice president, so cast as aforesaid. Witness our hands on this 17th day of December, AD 2024. Electors, these duplicate certificates have been prepared and signed in accordance with state and federal law and will be distributed as follows. 1, to the President of the United States Senate. 2, to the Archivist of the United States. 2, to the Delaware Secretary of State. 1, to the Chief Judge of the U.S. District Court for the State of Delaware. Madam Secretary, please prepare and sign the minutes of the official proceedings.
Madam Chair, the minutes have been prepared and signed.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, the electors have concluded their official business.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, electors, for performing your constitutional duties today. The electors have cast 3 votes for Kamala D. Harris of the state of California for President of the United States, and 3 votes for Tim Walz of the state of Minnesota for Vice President of the United States. So before we conclude, do any of our electors wish to make remarks?
I will.
Ms. Marshall.
Thank you. And I will be making remarks for all of the electors. And very quickly want to tell everyone here how privileged and honored we all are for being selected for this task, very important task on the behalf of the people of Delaware. And also very privileged and honored to cast our votes for the first African American and South Asian woman ever to run for President of the United States. And we hope that one day soon in our lifetimes that we will be electing a female president and join the rest of our sister nations in entrusting their governments to women. We are hoping for the very best from this new administration. We are hoping for the very best for all of us, and we hope for the best for the United States of America.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, all 3 of you, again, for your work. And a special thanks, if I could, to Ronnie and to everyone in the Department of State who made this possible today. It takes more than a little bit of work to coordinate all that. Our work here is done. Thank you all for joining us today, and may God bless this great state and the United States of America. Thank you all.
Thank you.